Wars rarely just explode out of nowhere. And the 1982 Lebanon War, well, that was the final massive explosion at the end of a 12-year fuse. It was a chain reaction, really, a series of dominoes that fell one after another, turning a tense border into an all-out war zone. So let's trace how that happened. And that really brings us to the core question here. How does something like a border, just a line on a map, actually become a bloody battlefield? We're going to follow the path from simmering tension to a full-scale invasion and see how each event just perfectly set the stage for the next. So here are the 4 big dominoes we're going to look at. It all kicks off in 1970 when the PLO gets kicked out of Jordan. Then, by 75, their arrival in Lebanon helps spark a civil war. Fast forward to 78, Israel launches a limited invasion, Operation Litani. And that all culminates in 1982 with a full-blown war. You'll see each step is a direct result of the one that came before it. Now, here's the interesting thing. This story about a war in Lebanon, doesn't actually begin in Lebanon. Nope. It starts next door in Jordan, with a dramatic conflict that would completely change the map of the entire Arab-Israeli conflict. And that first domino to fall is an event called Black September. See, in 1970, a radical faction inside the PLO went and hijacked 4 international planes, flew them to Jordan, and blew them up for the world to see. For Jordan's King Hussein, that was it. That was the last straw. He was terrified of foreign armies intervening, and frankly, he saw the PLO's power growing into a threat against his own throne. So he sent in the army, and after 10 brutal days and thousands of casualties, the PLO was kicked out of the country, forcibly. So now the PLO is homeless. They need a new base of operations. And Lebanon, well, Lebanon seemed perfect. It had a really weak central government and, importantly, a huge population of 400,000 Palestinian refugees already living there. So they packed up and moved their entire headquarters to Beirut. And just like that, the main front line of the conflict shifted from Jordan's border to Lebanon's. The arrival of thousands of armed PLO fighters wasn't just about finding a new mailing address. It was a seismic shift for Lebanon. They started to carve out their own territory, what you could really call a state within a state. In this area, mostly in southern Lebanon, even got a nickname, Fatahland. It became the PLO's personal fiefdom. They operated completely independent of the Lebanese government, and its location, right up against Israel's northern border, was definitely not a coincidence. So what did this mini-state actually do? Well, it's complicated. On one hand, the PLO set up schools and clinics providing really vital services for the Palestinian refugees, which built them a lot of loyalty. But on the other hand, they were collecting their own taxes, and most critically, they were using Fatahland as a launchpad for constant rocket attacks into northern Israel. This whole situation just shattered the fragile political balance in Lebanon between Christians and Muslims, and it became one of the main triggers of the devastating Lebanese Civil War that erupted in 1975. So you can see the pattern, right? The PLO attacks from Fatahland, and Israel hits back with reprisal raids. It just created this vicious, spiraling cycle of violence that kept getting worse and worse, until one specific attack just pushed the whole situation past the boiling point. In March of 1978, a group of Fatah militants came ashore on a beach in Israel. They managed to hijack a civilian bus that was driving down the main coastal highway, which led to a chase and a deadly shootout. The event became known as the Coastal Road Massacre. The final toll was just awful. 38 Israeli civilians were killed. 13 of them were children. An attack like that, on that scale, for the Israeli government, it demanded a response. A huge response. And just 3 days later, it came. Israel launched its first major invasion into Lebanon, codenamed Operation Litani. The public goal wasn't to conquer Lebanon, but to carve out a buffer zone to keep its northern towns safe. 26,000 Israeli soldiers poured across the border. They swept through southern Lebanon and did exactly what they set out to do. They pushed the PLO fighters north, away from the border. But the United States put on a lot of pressure, and Israel eventually agreed to pull back. So the UN sent in a peacekeeping force. But, and this is a huge but, Israel also set up its own security zone, a strip of land controlled by its local Christian allies. So the core problem wasn't solved at all. It was just paused, for now. For about a year, a really fragile ceasefire, put together by the US, actually held. But by 1982, the tension was just unbearable. The whole region felt like a powder keg. All it needed was a single spark. And that spark came on June 3, 1982, The Israeli ambassador in London was shot. Now here's the twist. The people who did it were a Palestinian splinter group, a rival of the PLO. The PLO had nothing to do with it. But for Israel's defense minister, Ariel Sharon, it didn't matter. This was the justification, the pretext he needed to launch the full-scale invasion he wanted, Operation Peace for Galilee. This is such a critical point. Publicly, the mission had a limited defensive goal, just push the PLO back 40 kilometers to get northern Israel out of rocket range. Simple. But the secret plan, Ariel Sharon's real plan, was way, way bigger. He wanted to go all the way to Beirut, completely crush the PLO's leadership, and install a friendly, pro-Israel Christian government to run the entire country. And the Israeli army moved incredibly fast. They blew right past the UN peacekeepers, and within just a few days, they had completely surrounded Lebanon's capital city, Beirut. What came next was a brutal 2-month siege. Israeli forces shelled West Beirut, where they had 15,000 PLO fighters trapped, alongside 500,000 civilians. Food, water, electricity, all cut off. The destruction was just unbelievable. And this wasn't happening in secret. The siege of a major world capital was playing out on television screens everywhere. These images of shattered buildings and civilian casualties, which were in the thousands, sparked massive international condemnation of Israel's actions. The end of the war completely redrew the map of the Middle East. A deal was struck, and Yasser Arafat and 14,000 of his fighters were evacuated by ship, moving their headquarters all the way to Tunis. Israel was hit with a storm of global criticism, especially after its Christian allies carried out horrific massacres in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. And here's the ultimate irony. By getting rid of the PLO, the invasion created a power vacuum in southern Lebanon that was filled almost immediately by a new, more radical Iranian-backed group, Hezbollah. So think about that. Israel absolutely achieved its military goal. The PLO was gone from Lebanon. But in doing so, they accidentally planted the seeds for decades of future conflict. Which leaves us with a pretty heavy question to think about. Can a clear military victory ever really lead to a lasting peace?